Opening the center immediately invites a dynamic battle for central squares and pawn structure development. Opening the door for the king's bishop, this move creates a flexible pawn structure, setting the stage for active piece play. Asserting central dominion, d4 immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to unlock white's pieces for an active middle game. Boldly challenging the center, this counterthrust immediately creates intricate pawn play and demands a swift response from white. Pushing the pawn forward creates immediate space, cramping black's position and offering white a potential outpost. Directly challenging white's central pawn spearhead with c5 creates immediate dynamism and opens lines for counterplay. Fortifying the center, white seeks to establish a robust pawn chain and restrict black's pieces, though it somewhat hinders their own light-squared bishop. Asserting central influence, this knight immediately challenges white's d4 pawn, opening up the queenside battleground. Developing knights harmoniously, this piece seeks central control and prepares kingside castling, indirectly eyeing black's pawn structure. Challenging the queenside center with an immediate queen sortie, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. Safeguarding the queenside pawn chain, this subtle advance prepares to meet black's potentially disruptive pawn pushes, like b5, while also creating a subtle outpost for a knight on b4 should the opportunity arise. Confronting white's pawn chain directly, black initiates a sharp pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it does weaken the kingside structure and could lead to tactical fireworks. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal aims to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and prepare for castling, all while contesting central influence after black's somewhat provocative pawn advance. Unleashing the pawn chain's tension, black deliberately embraces a tactical skirmish on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's smooth development and potentially expose the d3 bishop's defensive capabilities. Opening the d-file creates immediate pressure, demanding black's immediate attention to the central tension and the potential for piece activity along this newly exposed pathway. Indeed, black must now grapple with whether to defend the e5 pawn or develop. Asserting control over the central dark squares, this advance immediately cramps white's pieces and creates a deep outpost for the queen, though it also potentially weakens the d5 pawn. Seeking active piece play, this bishop repositions to a more dynamic diagonal, eyeing the queenside and potentially supporting a future kingside assault. It offers greater scope than its prior square. Confronting the advanced pawn, this maneuver aims to secure a safe haven for the king, though it potentially weakens the dark squares surrounding it and concedes significant central territory. Securing the king's safety is paramount, especially with the central pawn structure so dynamically locked and the queens poised for action. This maneuver brings the monarch to a much more sheltered position, paving the way for future piece development and defensive coordination. Positioning the bishop on the long diagonal is a sound idea, aiming to exert pressure on white's queenside and potentially create attacking chances. This piece development also clears the way for further pawn advances or piece maneuvering, preparing for the middle game struggle. Initiating a rook maneuver to the center creates active pressure along the open e-file, simultaneously preparing potential kingside support and a flexible central regrouping of pieces. Embarking on a knight maneuver to h6, black aims to relocate this piece to a more active square, potentially f5 or g4, where it can exert pressure on white's queenside or support future pawn pushes. This development, however, does leave the kingside somewhat less defended momentarily, a detail white might seek to exploit. Observe how this seemingly passive repositioning could become a tactical pivot, creating unexpected threats down the d-file or even influencing the crucial e5 pawn. Sacrificing the bishop opens a diagonal for your rook and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure around the king, potentially creating weaknesses later. Accepting the bishop's sacrifice instantly shatters black's central pawn structure and opens a diagonal towards their king, creating a promising tactical scenario for white. Challenging the central pawn chain with a pawn lever, this advance aims to pry open the queenside and create active play for the b-pawn, potentially targeting the c4 pawn and disrupting black's pawn structure. Seizing the open file is a priority, and this capture is a direct challenge for control of the central c-file, immediately altering the dynamic of the pawn structure. A bold recapture, reclaiming material but opening up the queen's diagonal and potentially isolating that bishop on c2. Safeguarding the monarch marks the immediate priority as the queenside pawn structure has become fractured, opening potential avenues for white's pieces. Initiating a rook maneuver to the second rank aims to bolster control over the open file, simultaneously creating defensive support for the d4 pawn and potentially preparing for future queenside activity as the game transitions towards a more positional struggle. Black's knight now ventures to the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially eye the d3 bishop or pressure the b3 pawn. This energetic repositioning, while seemingly a bit loose, attempts to exploit the slightly overextended nature of white's queenside pawns after Ra2. Consider the long-term implications of this knight's journey. If it can establish itself on a good square, it could become a significant attacking piece, but it also temporarily leaves the kingside less defended. Unleashing a knight from its slumber, this maneuver immediately challenges black's queen and knight, forcing a decision that will ripple through the pawn structure on the queen side. White seeks to disrupt black's nascent development and exploit the potential weakness created by the misplaced knight on a5. This initiative aims to gain central influence and possibly open lines for the rook on the e-file. Black solidifies the kingside pawn structure and prepares to redeploy the queen to a more active square, eyeing the d4 knight. Repositioning the bishop to c2 solidifies control over the important light squares around the king and prepares for potential central breaks or knight redeployments, aiming to challenge black's queenside initiative. Steering the rook towards the open c-file signifies a determined effort to contest central control and create counterplay. This strategic repositioning anticipates potential pawn advances by white on the queenside and aims to disrupt white's unified pawn structure. By actively engaging on the c-file, black seeks to limit white's piece mobility and potentially create weaknesses around the white king, which currently enjoys a well-protected castled position. It's a patient build-up, preparing for a more dynamic engagement in the coming moves, rather than a direct tactical assault. This move highlights black's understanding of the importance of open lines and piece coordination, particularly as the game transitions away from the opening phase. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white initiates an aggressive kingside expansion, aiming to exploit black's somewhat passive piece placement and the relatively undeveloped nature of white's own kingside, creating immediate spatial imbalances. The knight finds a dynamic post, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the weak b3 square, while also preparing to participate in the central struggle. Unleashing an aggressive pawn thrust, white aims to shatter black's kingside cover and expose the monarch, a bold gambit that demands black's immediate and precise response. Sacrificing the knight in this manner opens up the d-file for the rook and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses around the king. It's a bold attempt to seize the initiative, trading material for activity and hoping to exploit the temporarily uncoordinated white pieces. The intention is likely to follow up with aggressive pawn pushes or piece maneuvers on the queen side, forcing white onto the defensive. Opening that d-file now creates immediate tension, forcing black to confront the potential breakthrough and disrupting their kingside development by eliminating that active knight. The immediate objective here is to resolve the pawn structure on the kingside, which has been severely compromised by black's relentless pawn advances, and to find a way to activate the bishop on d7 that currently languishes behind its own pawns. However, the strategic implications of this seemingly passive placement are far-reaching, promising a slow buildup of pressure along the queenside and potentially a favorable endgame should the central pawns become locked. Opening the h-file creates immediate pressure against black's castled king, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure that resulted from g6. Opening the king's defender to the dark squares grants immediate attacking prospects along the h-file, potentially creating a pawn storm or opening lines towards the exposed white monarch. Unlocking the queen's rook file is the primary objective here, aiming to create immediate pressure on black's position and potentially isolate the weakened pawns. Grasping the initiative, black boldly captures the pawn, injecting immediate tension into the queenside and forcing white to defend their isolated d-pawn. Reasserting central influence is the immediate goal as white shifts the knight from the passive square, aiming to occupy the crucial d4 outpost which black has just vacated. This repositioning prepares for a potential kingside advance or a consolidation of the center, seeking to exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's queen. Capturing the rook on d1 immediately simplifies the position by exchanging major pieces, which is often a sound decision when one's own king is relatively safe, and the opponent's king is showing some potential weaknesses. This material gain, however, might lead to a slightly more open game where white's bishop pair could become a factor later on, so maintaining precise piece coordination will be paramount for black moving forward to capitalize on the advantage. The rook's re-entry onto the now open central file immediately sharpens the tactical battle, promising a dynamic contest for control of the critical d-file and posing a direct threat to black's isolated d-pawn. Reclaiming piece activity by anchoring the bishop to this diagonal aims to disrupt white's control over the d-file and potentially create attacking chances against the rather exposed white king. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure is a necessary defensive measure against black's bishop outpost and potential pawn breaks, aiming to solidify the shelter for the king. Repositioning the bishop to its original square is a prudent step, aiming to reconnect the dark-squared bishop with the c8-h3 diagonal and potentially redeploy it to a more active role, perhaps to f5 or g6, once the g-pawn advances further, thus reinforcing the center. Reoccupying the open file, white aims to redeploy their rook to a more active square and potentially contest the central files or create pressure along the kingside. The immediate goal is to gain better control over the scarce open lines, anticipating black's likely efforts to consolidate their pawn structure and activate their pieces further. This maneuver also prepares for future defensive maneuvers or offensive actions by freeing up the f1 square. Challenging white's queenside pawn structure by activating the rook, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and create potential counterplay along the fourth rank. Prioritizing safety, the king seeks a more sheltered square, anticipating potential future threats emanating from the open central files. Rethinking the central pressure and reinforcing the queen's rook lift into the fray, black repositions for a potential assault on white's queenside pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and exploit the open c-file. Reclaiming the initiative, this maneuver directly challenges black's battery on the c-file, forcing a decision about the dangerous doubled bishops and potentially opening lines for white's own rooks. Asserting dominion over the queenside, black immediately challenges white's exposed bishop and seeks to exploit the newly opened file for counterplay. Shifting the bishop to f1 aims to improve its diagonal placement, potentially supporting a future kingside advance or offering an escape square, while simultaneously preparing to contest the crucial d-file. A calculated risk is taken, seeking to pry open lines for the rooks while simultaneously creating a potential fortress against white's advancing pawn structure. Opening the central file irrevocably shifts the game's momentum, forcing black to confront immediate threats on the queenside and potentially exposing their king to an unexpected assault. The strategic reins are handed over as the last rook exchanges, initiating a simplified endgame where the pawn structure around the white king now presents a clear weakness. The b2 square, in particular, becomes a prime target for black's queen, hinting at potential infiltration and pressure that white will struggle to contain without further concessions. White opens up the queenside to challenge black's advanced pawn on a4, aiming to create weaknesses and gain space. Bringing the king into the heart of the remaining action, the monarch seeks central influence and prepares for a potential endgame scenario, where its active participation will be crucial for navigating the open lines and pawn structures. Seizing the open b-file now aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create endgame imbalances, potentially exploiting the isolated c-pawn if it becomes a weakness. Relocating the rook to the 7th rank initiates a strategic maneuver aimed at disrupting white's pawn structure and potentially creating endgame imbalances, leveraging the open file for future pressure. Pushing the pawn forward creates a new outpost for the rook on the queenside, potentially preparing a queenside pawn storm or aiming to restrict black's maneuvering space. Embracing the central open files, black's monarch ventures out, seeking an active role amidst the endgame's unfolding drama. Opening up lines for your rook on the c-file seems to be the primary objective here, aiming to exploit the weakness on the queen side. Shifting the bishop to the edge of the board, a seemingly passive maneuver, aims to support the pawn push and prepare for a potential exchange on the d-file, seeking to untangle the queen's rook and open up lines for action. The rook now establishes a commanding presence on the fourth rank, a silent sentinel aiming to disrupt black's nascent queenside pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn down the file if the opportunity arises. Seizing the central pawn offers a promising avenue, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's pieces. Initiating a counterattack on the queen side, the rook's redeployment aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the isolated d-pawn. Pushing the rook to the fifth rank immediately challenges white's central pawns and aims to disrupt their consolidated structure, potentially opening lines for counterplay. Initiating a pawn storm on the queen side offers a slight territorial advantage, but it pulls the rook away from the critical central files that are now opening up, potentially leaving the king exposed to future threats. Shifting the bishop to c6 revitalizes black's central presence, creating a dynamic interplay with white's potentially exposed king, while simultaneously eyeing the b3 pawn and preparing to exploit the open d-file. Unleashing the bishop on that now exposed diagonal is a bold maneuver, aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain and exploit the weakened dark squares around their king. Reclaiming the pawn opens up lines and activates your rook, aiming to contest the open c-file and exploit the exposed white king. Puncturing the queenside structure with this pawn thrust forces the bishop to a passive square and opens up potential infiltration routes along the newly created semi-open file. Undermining the pawn chain with the rook's advance opens fascinating endgame possibilities, although it surrenders the a-file momentarily. The bishop repositions, eyeing the d4 pawn, which is now under considerable pressure, and seeks to reinforce the central structure after the rather aggressive pawn push on the queen side that has left white's king somewhat exposed. Unlocking the central pawns with this advance is a bold, yet possibly premature, attempt to disrupt white's control of the open file and potentially create passed pawn opportunities. However, it significantly weakens the pawn chain and invites counterplay down the c-file. Targeting the open file is a shrewd maneuver, aiming to disrupt black's rook coordination and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queen side. The bishop on c3 boldly reclaims its active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially threaten the c2 square, forcing reconsideration of the advance to pawn's safety.